Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Tatarski, and I'm the Director of Clinical Programming here at Freedom Institute, where I oversee clinical programming, clinical services, and our harm reduction psychotherapy training programs. Welcome to this month's Meet and Learn, which is really focused on Latinx communities and the need for harm reduction interventions. And we have two very special people, guests who will be discussing this topic, Genoveva Garcia and Tamara Oyola Santiago. So before we get into the session, I'd like to say a few words about Freedom Institute and our Meet and Learn series. Freedom Institute is an outpatient addiction program in Midtown Manhattan, and it's been around for about 50 years. We are currently offering comprehensive, individualized, harm reduction informed clinical services to people who struggle with problematic substance use and addiction and their families. And the harm reduction frame is really that we invite people into treatment wherever they are ready to begin their positive change journeys with us in all stages of change around all positive change goals, so that we're really seeing the harm reduction umbrella as one that really meets people who are struggling, who are unclear about their goals, who are considering moderation, and who are pursuing abstinence. And the way that we put that into practice is that we have a very well-respected, abstinence-focused intensive outpatient program, and we have a whole range of individualized services, including individual, group, family, and couples therapy that we can really tailor to the unique needs, goals, motivation of people across that entire spectrum. Our monthly Meet and Learn series is really designed to explore the application of a harm reduction framework to different populations who have different needs, to different modalities, and so on. And we hope that these events will really be educational for all of us, as well as networking, building relationships, and building community. So now to the topic of the day, harm reduction in Latinx communities. The Latinx community is a growing, diverse population within the United States. Given its heterogeneity, what do we know about patterns of drug use and risk for overdose on opioids and other problematic substances that are out there in the illicit drug market? How do we support community-led harm reduction that is culturally and linguistically centered? Join us for this dialogue, and we do hope that after our presentations, you will all contribute to the dialogue. We will present the need for an anti-racist epidemiology and share the Narcanazo initiative. That's one example of a Latinx opioid overdose initiative. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. So if we can bring them on screen. Welcome, Tamara and Genoveva. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And sharing your time and your wisdom and experience with us. Tamara Oyola Santiago is a harm reductionist. That's her first identity, according to her bio. Areas of life work include harm reduction grounded in critical pedagogy, social justice, and equity in Puerto Rico and New York City, HIV/AIDS, decriminalization, restorative practices, and prison abolition. Tamara graduated from the University of California in Los Angeles with graduate degrees in Latin American Studies and Public Health. After graduate school, Tamara joined the National Institutes of Health as a presidential management fellow. At the New School, she also completed the Center for Optimal Living's Harm Reduction Psychotherapy Certificate Program, which I put together, and Tamara has participated in. I've also known Tamara for many, many years. We have actually collaborated in different presentations a number of times. And she's a good friend and colleague. So thank you for being with us. Genoveva Garcia is a family therapist here at the Freedom Institute. She also has a private practice. She's a clinical social worker specializing in family and couples therapy with 17 years of experience. She uses a systemic frame to help families heal in the context of substance use and addiction. With a BA from the Psychology Silberman School of Social Work, she facilitates parent and significant others support groups. In addition, Genoveva has experience with issues around trauma, chronic mental illness, infant mental health, and life transitions. Genoveva is on the teaching faculty at the Ackerman Institute for the Family and maintains a private practice of seeing families and individuals in New York City. And while Genoveva and I are newer colleagues, I've really come to respect and appreciate the work that you do. In fact, our last Meet and Learn series was focused on family therapy and harm reduction. And Genoveva was one of our family therapists that contributed to that. That's available now on recording, and I would highly recommend that people take a look at that. It was just a brilliant conversation that Genoveva participated in. So we thought that we would begin with brief introductions from each one of you. And you might also share a little bit about kind of how you understand harm reduction and its relevance to Latinx communities. And then we'll have a formal presentation by Tamara and open it up to conversation between us and then with the participants out there. So Tamara, do you want to begin?
Hello, hola, buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Tamara. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella en español. It is an honor to be here with Genoveva and Andrew and with you all who are joining us remotely, virtually. I'm a migrant to New York City. Home is Boriquen, Puerto Rico. And that multiplicity of homes acknowledges that part of my migrant experience is also my relationship with substances, right? That culturally acknowledging that what we use and how we use it in Puerto Rico also migrates to what happens and how we use and what we utilize in New York City, in the Bronx specifically. And so in my work with Bronx Mobile, there's this acknowledgement of use across the diaspora and how that's impacted by systems that include transphobia and homophobia, mass incarceration and the war on drugs, sexism, right? Racism. We use substances for a variety of reasons, everything from pleasure and because it's socially acceptable to ways in which we deal with unhealed trauma. And so the work that I do in harm reduction basically acknowledges that as human beings, we use substances. I start the morning with un cafecito con leche. Guess what? It has caffeine. Eso es una droga, right? So just being able to talk about it it's revealing and destigmatizes and opens up the conversation, as Andrew would say, to the curiosity of why we use, right? And this experience that is expansive in our relationships with each other. So I'll start with that, and I'll pass it to Genoveva. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. I am from Mexico, and I've been here for a number of years. So I think that part of my identity, feeling that my heart is in two places, and my heart and my mind is in two places, or I have two hearts and two minds. Right? I'm both from New York City as well as from Guadalajara, and I find home, in different places where I co-create and where I feel that I belong. And also I have the experience of not belonging or not being from here, right? So I think like those dichotomies and the recognition of that part of my identity. I think it's really important. And I think of, there are different things that you name that definitely that I feel connected with. This idea of just identity and culture. I think of like what is harm reduction, right? What is the meaning of harm reduction? I think of like the different tenets, that organize that principle, that approach of like radical acceptance and the focus on harm and not on the drugs, and the respect for autonomy, and having some knowledge or getting to know what are the individual goals, what is the that's important, using the non-judgmental and compassionate approach, and meeting people where they're at, as well as reducing the stigma. I think all of that, if I think of the Latinx community here, like all of that definitely applies to really understanding the community, right? And really connecting with, meeting people where they're at, rather than thinking about one size fits all, thinking about a more individualized approach in every intervention that we make. I think that's definitely important. Part of my work is really to connect from a collaborative place in where I work, regardless of whether who the family is. It's like who am I, and who the person who's in front of me is. And with the Latinx community, it's definitely something very, very important, rather than imposing or just defining who you are. I think when people have the possibility of defining themselves and having a choice in that definition, feels quite expansive, and there are many possibilities.
Wow, thank you so much. I just want to add one thing that, what you both said inspired in me, the way that I think about kind of a radical harm reduction approach, is that it's really about challenging ourselves to kind of get on top of our internalized stigma, our internalized social narratives, what I call social countertransference. That is, narratives about who the other is, about who drug users are, about who people that are different from us are, and that all of those internalized narratives can really contaminate our ability to see this unique person living in unique social circumstances. And so challenging all of that to try to put it to the side, a harm reduction approach is then about really trying to listen, to create a safe space, to invite the other to present themselves or to be with us. And that then sets the stage for us, starting where they are and taking our lead from them to figure out how we might support them on their journey, in their process, rather than imposing, as you said. So I love what you both said to kind of set the frame for this discussion. Any other comments before we turn the floor over to Tamara?
Yeah, I mean, just want to add one thing, that I believe that la cultura cura, just culture heals, right? So when we create interventions or connections acknowledging the cultural differences and cultural similarities, and we have the possibility of healing, right? And so what I mean by that, it's not only to think about who the other is, but really to think about what that connection means. So really, and I think the harm reduction approach invites us to think about, I think what you said, Tamara, earlier, like this idea of reflecting on who we are, like what are the different identities. Like I drink coffee in the morning, and there's a meaning in drinking that coffee in the morning, connected with who I am, what I like. So really having that reflection of who we are as individuals, and who the person in front of us is can bring the curiosity can be expansive in that interaction. So that I think of like the importance of cultural humility and how harm reduction approach can really invites us to be more reflective and think about who we are and how we can begin this search, and this motivation or this exploration of what are the different meanings that people make. So I just want to name that.
I love that, Genoveva, and I hope that folks will see that connection between La Cultura Cura and Narcanazo, which is an opioid overdose prevention program developed by community members in the Bronx to address the opioid overdose crisis in our community, in the Bronx and across New York City. And it is precisely the leveraging and the centering and uplifting of credible messengers, people from the community who are survivors of the war on drugs, who are survivors of that racialized drug policy, and who have survived overdoses, who then become the messengers of educación, vamos a hablar, let's talk about drugs, right? This is Narcan, this is how you use it, this is how you integrate it into your barbershop, nail salon, bodega, and into your church, right? So I want to talk about that because Narcanazo literally activates what Genoveva just said. And it is people from the community who have to be front and center in the fight against the overdose crisis. We have to be able to center what traditionally happens in many health promotion programs, que son Latinos y Latinas, que son los promotores, las promotoras de salud, right? And for us in Bronx Mobile, it's about community leaders. And other kind of like models that are culturally relevant would be the promotores model, right? And so Narcanazo does that. It does that in community, uplifting and centering the leadership of the people most impacted. And those are the people using drugs who are survivors of the opioid crisis. So, yeah.
So with that, do you want to take over and
There we go. Thank you so much. So here we go. So some learning objectives for our time together is I'm going to be presenting this term that we called antiracist epidemiology. And it comes direct from the work of Drs. Manuel Cano and Camila Elpia Costa. And within this model, what they're saying is this social construct of a Latinx actually needs to be disaggregated. It needs to be unpacked. Because in fact, we are a very diverse community that's been lumped together, right? But when we want to address health disparities and create meaningful and effective health promotion programs, we need to make them culturally relevant. So there's the cultural relevance in the umbrella category of Latinx, but Genoveva and I, previous in preparation for today's time together, talked about language and how it differs between, for example, Mexico and Puerto Rico. Syringes in Mexico are jeringas. In Puerto Rico, it's jeringuillas, right? And so if I'm designing a campaign, I need to understand how language is important in health promotion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to present Narcanazo, which is this campaign on opioid overdose prevention that was designed by La Maraña. La Maraña is basically a loose collective of Bronx residents, all Latinos, who said, we have to do something with this data. It is our people who are dying, and we need to do something about it. And that's how Narcanazo was born. Can I get the next slide, please? All right, so I'm part of Bronx Mobile. I am one of the co-founders. We've been active since 2018, aquí en las calles del Bronx, and parts of Washington Heights and Manhattan. And essentially, we are a collective that amplifies the leadership of people who use drugs, or past and present, as leaders of the movement of harm reduction and leaders in the work that we do in the community. We hit the streets basically 7 days a week, which definitely on weekends, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, when we know that there's a dearth of services for folks who are unhoused and experiencing housing insecurity. We believe that in the city that never sleeps, harm reduction must be 24/7, and it must be culturally and linguistically centered. The Bronx Mobile team, all of us know Spanish because, in fact, who is most impacted by housing insecurity on the streets of the Bronx are Puerto Ricans. That is the vast majority. And if not Puerto Ricans, then it's Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so if we're going to go out there, we need to speak the language that makes sense to them, that speaks. That's the culturally and linguistically relevance. The other thing is Bronx Mobile is all composed of people who are harm reductionists. We understand this model of meeting people where they're at. We understand what Genoveva and Andrew were talking about because we've lived it, right? So next slide, please. All right, so why health on the streets? And I already kind of alluded to this, but there's an economic and mobility privilege when we assume that people can come to the clinic or can come to the community-based agency for services. But in fact, we're working with the folks that are most deeply impacted by income and by health inequity and inequality. There's a privilege when I assume that somebody can actually hop on the train, have enough money for that MetroCard swipe. And also, by meeting them where they are in their community, hopefully I will ameliorate some of the stigma that they face navigating the subway and the buses, right? Many of them don't have access to a bathroom, right? To the standard kind of like what we do when we prepare ourselves to go out into the street. And so by meeting where they're at, we're almost like saying, aquí estamos, we're here to support you. And so when I talk about harm reduction, my primary definition is radical love. Radical love is harm reduction. It's this acknowledgement of the human rights and the human dignity of people who are using drugs, right? And that adds is that layered matrix of you're also unhoused, right? There's this vulnerability because of income inequality. So we go beyond the walls of a building and we meet people where they're at, literally. Intersections, under trains, under puentes, under bridges, intersections, and their encampments. And I think that the pandemic proved that this model is valid, that in fact, mobile outreach on the streets became the primary modality under which we were actually providing a lot of COVID-19 services. Think of all the mobile vehicles that went all over New York City. That's where we were getting vaccinated and tested, right? And so COVID-19 proved that, in fact, there could be high quality medical and healthcare services, including mental health service provision on the streets. We don't always have to go to a building for that. We can actually think about how to be creative and go into neighborhoods. And it's not just about people who are unhoused. Think of elders. Think of working families and not being able to actually make it on time to the clinic. It would be beautiful if we could actually leverage resources so that folks could access those kinds of services after hours and in their communities. Next slide, please. All right. So again, it kind of reiterates some of the points that I've talked about before, but systems impacted folks have experience, again, because we live in a really capitalistic society where there is no universal health care. They experience chaotic and inconsistent health care. There's limited access to safe and secure housing, especially in a city like New York City, which I call that it's capitalism on steroids, and are vulnerable because of all the systems of oppression, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. And for folks who are migrants, many Latinx and Asian Pacific Islander communities, and others of the global South who arrive into New York City, there's also the cultural and the linguistic challenges of being in an English dominant system, right? All of that contributes to the different factors that we call the social determinants of health. So the Bronx Mobile Response is a mutual aid anti-racist collective. Ours is a cooperative model where lived experiences are as valued in credentials. And we do that in two ways. One is an equal equity wage per hour. We all earn the same wage, whether you are credentialed or not. The lived experience is just as valued as the credential. And second thing is with titles. We all have leader as part of our title. So I am program leader. Alexis Del Rio, who is one of the co-founders, is education leader. Nelson Gonzalez, other co-founder, is outreach leader. Our participants who get trained and become part of the team are community leaders, and so on. So we really try to acknowledge and unpack the power dynamics. There's always power dynamics, but we try to address them head on. Next slide, please. All right. So why did we get started? And I wanted to present some data because this is really important. Is that in fact from New York City data from 2020, we know that the rate of unintentional overdose deaths varied by race, ethnicity, and age. And so I invite you all who are joining us to actually look at the slide and as I walk through it, right, just to think about what this means. So the three broad categories are Black, Latinx, and white. And we can see, in fact, that for both Black and Latinx communities, the overall rates were higher, not by much compared to whites, but in fact, there are vast differences when we look at age, right? And in fact, also when we look at it by gender. It is elders in the Black and Latino communities who are overdosing and dying. And so we need health promotion campaigns that actually address those vulnerabilities specific, that consider gender, sex, race, ethnicity, language, etc. Next slide, please. So I wanted us to go deeper into the Latino New Yorker death, right? And this is New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene data from 2020. And I talked about the heterogeneity of the Latino community and you can actually scan the QR code for those of you who are at home because it links to the report. I just want you all to know that. But essentially, the Latino community experience varies very specifically by place of origin of birth. And what we know is that Puerto Rican men specifically have a higher rate of overdose and of death, of what they call the unintentional death. And so again, I don't want to go deep into this, but I wanted to present it. You get the QR code and you can look at the research that's come out with all of this. But it was not easy getting to this data of actually looking at who's vulnerable among the Latinos in the city. And that's where the next slide comes in, please. How did we get to this unpacking of data? It's a key part for those of us on the call that are public health practitioners and mental health providers in our communities. It's that we cannot forget that much of the work that we do in direct clinical work, in direct service provision, needs to consider advocacy as a key part of the pie, right? Like the work that Genoveva, Andrew, and I do always is about advocacy of resources, advocacy of culturally competent programs, advocacy of knowing the data, and how can we have access to the data. So the work of Manuel Cano and Camila Gelpia Costa, who I mentioned earlier, essentially showed that nationwide, across the USA, there was an opioid overdose crisis that was disproportionately impacting certain Latino communities, and specifically stateside Puerto Ricans, right? And so they looked at the data age adjusted between 2009 and 2018. And what they found is that our rates are actually much higher if you're Puerto Rican heritage versus non-Latino white individuals. But we know that the mainstream narrative that we heard over the news with big pharma and the crisis around the opioid crisis was that it was mostly non-Latino whites who are being impacted. The work of Cano and Helpia Costa basically said, yeah, actually, that is true if you compare Latinos and whites. But when you unpack the Latinx category, the Puerto Rican stateside community actually has higher rates than whites. WOA, so important, right? And so what they call for is this urgency of surveillance data disaggregation, that we actually need to unpack it, and that this is part of anti-racist epidemiology. Next slide, please. All right, so we heard about the data, and we actually worked very closely with Camila Helpia Costa, one of the researchers, one of the social scientists. And she assembled and convened a group of Bronx-based community members to chew on that data and say, look, this is what I found nationally in working with Manuel. This is what we found. We need to do something about it. And so a group of Bronx-based residents, all Latinos, essentially chewed on the data. As in, what does this big statistic mean for us here in the Bronx? How do we simplify the terminology so that we're able to present it in a way that makes sense both in Spanish and in English? We considered health literacy. We considered literacy in general. And what we came up with is the Narcanazo campaign. And so we basically said, look, we need to mobilize with education and action. We need to get trained and train others in the use of Narcan, of naloxone, of naloxone, right? It's a medication that as of September 2023 is available over the counter. How do we activate it so it becomes part of the first aid kits in our homes and in our workplaces and in our spaces of faith and spirituality and in bodegas and other spaces, right? We also felt that we needed to be able to talk about drugs, that in fact, in many of our families and many of our communities within the Latino community, it's hard to talk about drugs. It's highly stigmatized because it's seen as a moral failure, as a moral issue, right? Encuentra a Dios y te salvarás, right? It really becomes about a moral failure, and that in many ways, those belief systems come from home. We bring them across the Atlantic. We bring them across with us when we cross the Rio Grande as we migrate to this country. But we need to be able to unpack it and address it. And we need to do it by charlando, by hablando, by having informal dialogues that are science-based and that destigmatize. We also thought it was really important to do it across venues, right? It can't just be in the family or with a formal health educator during the presentation. No, we thought we need to incorporate the formal and the formal leaders that exist in our kinfolk networks. And that together we can heal, that we can work towards a community empowerment where we can actually start to center the human rights of all human beings, including people who use drugs. All right, next slide, please. And this is what we came up with, y'all. So I'm going to present the 2 slides with the images, and then I want to pause and open up the conversation with Genoveva and Andrew and with you all. So first in Spanish, right? So again, the community members, La Maraña, looked at the data and worked closely with Camila and with Manuel. And the statistics that stood out for us, again, we're Bronx-based, was that 1, we need to be able to talk about who's being impacted, right? So essentially what the statistics found was that 1 out of every 5 Boricuas, that's Puerto Ricans, who died of an overdose in the US were from New York. So the community members literally designed this, y'all, that you all are seeing, right? We needed to emphasize the Puerto Rican flag. We needed to use the right blue. For those of you from Puerto Rico know that there's different colors of blue. So we really thought that was important. We wanted to highlight that it was 1 out of 5 men. That's why the images of the silhouettes are kind of like are perceived as masculine. Right. So you know the data, and then we thought it was really important to present a plan of action. Right. So you know the data, and now go get that Narcan. And then we provide the information for Bronx Mobile that then is able to go meet them and do the capacity building, both for individuals and community members. Next slide, please. And it's the same thing, but in English, right? So again, multiplicity of languages. So we basically did double-sided, and we distributed this all over the place. We continue to do so. In fact, Narcanazo has become the Bronx Mobile Opioid Overdose Prevention, and it gets activated every single day when we hit the streets, providing mobile harm reduction. All right, stop share, Shanta, please. And I want to open it up for conversation with you all.
Mm-hmm. Well, shall we first invite Genoveva to comment, to question, or to share your own perspective?
Yeah, I feel deeply moved by this work, so important work that you're doing. I think of this view of anti-racist, right? Like really challenging so many divides in our society, right? And really work to have a socially just approach. That's what I think is just so profoundly moving. And the numbers are so I'm still, I don't know, it's so important, to name what's happening, but also profoundly sad, right? Pienso los están matando, right? Like it's this, they're being killed, right? So what are the different ways that we can really challenge and support the community? So I think it's a beautiful project. So
And one thing that really jumps out at me, I feel the same way, just deeply, deeply moved, but that you're really putting a sort of a central tenet of harm reduction, which is empowerment, which is honoring, appreciating, inviting each person's expertise into whatever the process is, and leveling the playing field, to whatever extent we can, or the power playing field, so that we are coming together. You are coming together with community members on an equal footing, and inviting them to take leadership. It's just such a beautiful and inspiring example of harm reduction in action, in community organizing.
Thank you. I will say this, and you all who are participated and who are here joining the webinar, you will actually get access to the article which we published recently in the American Journal of Public Health, where we describe the Narcanazo campaign and the successes, but also the challenges. And I want to name that unpacking of data that we got in 2020 from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene actually required a lot of work across both city and state officials. And that an ally became State Senator Gustavo Rivera, who then advocated at the Department of Health state level in New York to basically get that data. And that community activists like La Maraña and Bronx Mobile actually think that release of data should happen automatically, annually, for all the diseases that our community lives that are social determinants of health. Think of asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, right? And that in fact, a lot of those diseases, because of poverty, because of socioeconomic inequity, it's not just about us, it's also Black Americans. And Black Americans can be impacted, right? Black Caribbean, African diaspora, and same with the Asian Pacific Islander community. Think about what a heterogeneous community that is. It includes everyone from the Philippines to the Hmong people to South India to Bangladesh. Like it's a little bit ridiculous, to be honest with y'all, that we have these social constructs that are so heterogeneous and varied that they actually start to hide data. And so we believe that anti-racist epidemiology, and again, this comes from Manuel Cámano and Camila Gelpia Costa, just shout out to PhD social scientists who are uplifting and doing kind of like the science that we then need in the community to do the work.
Mhm.
What community activists advocate for, and we haven't been able to, no lo hemos logrado. We hope that we get there and we continue to advocate for it, is that in fact New York City State and New York City Department of Health should release those major diseases that have that kind of like social determinant of health impact, that they should unpack it for us. That we shouldn't have to rely on two scientists to do it on their own time as part of the research to be able to get to that deep and meaningful data that then feeds effective health promotion programs. We're not there yet. So with the opioid overdose data, we got it in 2020, which I shared with you all, and they also released it in 2022. But we actually think that needs to be baselined. Again, across different racial and ethnic groups, and also for different diseases. That's in fact socially just within the equity model.
Great, thank you. And Oveva, do you want to take the stage now, and you have some comments on this topic that you wanted to share?
Not on the stage. I think it's more having a conversation about this. I think it makes more sense because I think it's what are the different interventions that are being used in the community, and I think of like the stigma of drugs, but also the stigma of mental health and mental health treatment, right? And so thinking about what are the in being able to work with this model and being able to just bring a non-judgmental lens to and working with this community can be very impactful. So I think one way I love the way of like bringing this bringing the data and like making it public and actually helping people desenmarañar, like unpack and really untangle all the different things, because I think it might be like what does that the different numbers mean. So I think of like the different interventions that can be helpful to destigmatize and to bring to destigmatize the drug use, but also in general mental health approach in the Latinx community. I think there are different ways that we can just like connect with people in a different way, in a non-judgmental way, and really help people ask for help, get some support in different areas. And I think of like the ways that the different institutions make it accessible, for people to ask for help, right? To get some support.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe you can say a little more about that, speaking as a therapist, kind of what this looks like in individual or family therapy practice, how harm reduction is expressed in those contexts.
Yeah. I think, when we think of this idea of collaboration and meeting people where they're at, and really, I think it's hard for people, for the Latinx community, and in general, I think it's hard, or more difficult, more challenging for people from our community to get some support. And I think one of the first things that happens is there's the fear, but there's also the experience of feeling judged. And once people ask for help, and begin to talk about some of the challenges they encounter, a lot of judgment, right, in general.
Mhm.
So I think like really using a non-judgmental approach, and I think of like really connecting people from this with this lens of culturally sensitive, and really being curious about our field. We we spend many years in training thinking about what are the different diagnoses, and so we have part of our work is to identify what is wrong with the individual, or what is wrong with the family, right? And I think being able to connect with people and think about their strengths, and think about normalizing some of their experiences that people bring to therapy. It's a way of opening and being curious, and not from a place of judgment, but from a place of curiosity, and helping them develop a narrative, and supporting, being a supportive of creating a different narrative for themselves and in the community. The other thing is that I think is there we have different assumptions, right? And I think we in terms of our lens, using a white heteronormative approach, right? Like one size fits all, or this is the normal and this is the abnormal. I think that creates a just enhances, or the the sense of feeling judged, and thinking about engaging people from that place of a culturally sensitive place, and really thinking about what are the different contexts, right? And thinking about what are the different layers, or different layers of context that people have to navigate, right? I think that's definitely important in connecting with people, and understanding what they're bringing to therapy.
If I could also just do a quick shout out to what Genoveva,
Sure.
I want to uplift what Genoveva is saying, and it is this need to promote mental health services in community. And I think that one of the neatest things I've ever seen is when I literally see community acupuncture on the sidewalk, when I see medical providers on the sidewalk, literally walking the community block. And I've also seen psychotherapists do that, right? It's this attempt to truly meet people where they're at. And it's not just in the psychosocial, but also in the real time and place of the city. And so in many ways, what I'm advocating for within Bronx Mobile and with Narcanazo and the work that you all are doing is, let's think creatively about how to truly meet people where they're at. That includes the bio, the psycho, the social, and then also the real time and place wherever it is that we're at. And I do think that we can do this in a good way that's effective, high quality. We need to be creative about it, but I think it works. And the fact is, when somebody's experiencing chaotic and disruptive drug use, they may not be able to go in for mental health care services provision because of their use, because they're out of, they're not able to basically create the space to do that and travel. But I think they could create it, and we could be created, and that we could, meet them where they're at. And we say, you know what? No, you don't have to come here to la clínica. I'll come to you. Vamos a ver dónde nos encontramos. And I've seen it happen, and it can be very effective and beautiful. And it's part of the healing process for the person.
What both of you said it brought back a memory. I was once giving a grand rounds at a major hospital's, psychiatric grand rounds. And afterwards, I overheard the chairman of the department talking to one of his colleagues. And he said, You know, it's easy to say meet people where they're at, but what does it really mean? I
Hmm.
mean, he was really kind of, chewing on that. And I think this is one of the most powerful, provocative phrases, right? I mean, provocative in a positive sense, to provoke us to really think creatively about how do we really meet people where they are, as they are, who they are. And, what you're saying, both of you, in different ways, is that it challenges us to get out of a lot of our old models, which are, Western colonialist, white models of how we do therapy, how we help, and be willing to step out. And you're really emphasizing literally meeting people in the street, if that's where they are. And that's been one of the most challenging and kind of exciting parts of my evolution as a harm reduction therapist, to really be willing to question a lot of what I was taught in school, both in terms of diagnosis and thinking of people as sick, and also in terms of having a particular frame for what therapy is. And being willing also, I think one of you mentioned, the collaborative part is central to this harm reduction notion. Rather than imposing our ideas about what helping should look like, we need to invite people to be active participants in a collaborative process to help us figure out how we can be helpful to them.
I think that feels very common, like, and I think sometimes it's not uncommon to, meet someone and say, when they come to your office and say, like, you tell me what I need to do, right? And so tell me what I'm doing wrong, what I should change in my life, and what are the specific things that I need to do, right? So to be able to really connect with people and find a space where they can feel empowered, right? That you're facilitating a process where they can feel empowered and they can, feel, yes, you can guide, you can offer some expertise in asking questions, but really honoring that they are the experts of their lives, right? And that making space to really empower that knowledge that they have, and to, help support them in making decisions that make sense for them, in an informed and an empowered way, feeling, I want to change this, or I want to do this, or I want to go this way, or I want to move this way or this other way. I think that's a fine, that's an important aspect of our work, right? To really be able to support people from that space, to facilitate a process where they can feel empowered. And I think that's in using harm reduction, but I think that also is at the heart of an important, or culturally sensitive therapy, I would say.
I'm going to uplift as well the work that needs to happen in the public policy arena. And again, I mentioned advocacy is a key part of the Narcanazo campaign. But I want to just name that one of the biggest challenges that I see for folks who again, my participants in Bronx Mobile, who are experiencing that chaotic and disruptive drug use, right, is that oftentimes they do want to be able to moderate, manage, and explore harm reduction. But the unsafe, unregulated drug supply makes it extremely difficult because of what's in the US drug supply, because of the racialized drug policy. And so I just want to name it because those of us doing harm reduction work, whether that's in harm reduction psychotherapy, in direct clinical service, or in harm reduction organizations like mine with Syringe Exchange, is that in fact that matrix of that unregulated drug supply makes it incredibly difficult for folks to be able to enter that relationship with harm reduction, whether that be the abstinence model or the moderation of use, right? The whole spectrum of what is harm reduction. So I think that is part of our homework as providers, is to try to figure out that drug supply, because what's working right now in terms of criminalization is making it worse. It's making it worse, right? So I want to name the importance of public policy in this field, as it's got to happen at the same time that we do the service provision.
Yeah, and speaking of the poison drug supply, I want to give a shout out to a woman named Yaralix Estrada, who is working with the New York City Department of Health. And she is actually got a traveling drug testing machine. And she's actually going into the community to enable people to test their drugs to be safer. And I think that you talk about public policy. I think that we need to make drug testing widely available, because there are so many contaminants and poisons in the illicit drug supply right now that it's really dangerous out there. I wonder if at this point we should go to some questions. I'm wondering if any of the participants have questions or comments that you would like to share with us, and we can invite a kind of dialogue with the community that's joined us. Shanta, do we have any questions from participants, or we had some questions prepared? What are the challenges in integrating community members into your setting? Right. So I think you kind of spoke about stigma or about conflicts, about seeking help. But so maybe this question is kind of getting at that. Well, here's another one. How can you integrate mobile harm reduction into your organization if you're not doing it right now?
Yeah, I wonder, well, with that one, if we could just pause before we keep popping into questions really quickly. This issue of I would actually step back and say, if you're here and you're from the world of psychology and direct clinical mental health provision, is to really pause and think about, is the work that I'm doing, or that the organization or clinic that I'm in, is it harm reduction, right? So again, I just want to acknowledge that there might be a wide variety of settings in the call right now. But to really think about, what am I doing, or what is the clinic doing that is harm reduction? And if it's not 100% harm reduction, then what needs to change? Or if that is something that speaks to the values and mission of the organization, right? Because again, just want to acknowledge the different flavors, if you will, of mental health clinical practice, right, Andrew? So it's like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are so many misunderstandings, even amongst very thoughtful, educated, progressive people, open-minded people, who think that harm reduction, for example, is simply letting people continue to use drugs. I'd like to suggest that harm reduction has harm in the first word. Reduction is the second word. So we really have a value of supporting people in reducing harm to the greatest extent possible, which for some people is abstinence, and other people is safer using practices. And and let's go back to starting where people are. It is the greatest extent possible of harm reduction as the individual defines it. So there really is no a global standard, I think, which is really in line with what both of you have been saying. We want to empower people to figure out what their healthiest, ideal relationship to substances is. or other potentially risky behaviors. Right, so abstinence is not at odds with harm reduction, right? That's another, is it harm reduction or is it abstinence? Well, if it's an umbrella that's really about meeting people across all of these diverse identities and motivations and goals, it's a really lovely, loving big tent that wants to be inclusive and welcoming to everyone, wherever they are in their journey, their process.
Thank you, Andrew. I just want to do for those of us on the what and Andrew, look at the comments, because I think that there are two questions there that I would like us to address. The first one is, there we go. Thank you. Has anyone had any positive conversations with Latinx faith groups when talking about harm reduction? And if so, what did that sound like? We have had some luck, but not with the larger faith groups.
Mm-hmm. You want to speak to that? Yeah.
So I'll say this, and again, as part of the Narcanazo campaign, we actually haven't focused yet on Latinx faith groups, but we have had really successful conversations in partnership with Black faith communities. It's been fascinating. Several deacons that are part of the New York State Department of Health Faith Initiative, who are Bronx-based, saw me basically do a presentation on Narcanazo and the work. I was doing a virtual training on naloxone for different members of the faith community across the state. And then they invited me to their community of faith. So I went to Sunday service, and I've done this several times. Sunday service, I sit in, I get there a little bit late, and I'm able to participate in the actual spiritual community. And then afterwards, they make an announcement of, there's going to be an naloxone workshop. Everybody who can, please stay. And then I literally go up to the pulpit and do a naloxone workshop. Maybe not from the pulpit, but you know what I mean, from the stairs in front. And the turnout and the reactions of the community are beautiful. There is this curiosity that is innate, and they want to know more information. And oftentimes it's about dispelling the myths that exist in the community. And oftentimes it is about uplifting the data. So we know that in New York City right now, it is Black elders who are dying at greater numbers. So I usually will ask the community, I'll give them the statistics, and then I'll go, ¿Y por qué? Why do you think this is? Let's talk about it. And oftentimes they already know the answer, or there's the answer across many different voices. And then we talk about some of the solutions as naloxone. So this is what I will say. Sometimes it's not the big faith organizations. It is the community churches with pastors and deacons who will invite you in. And I believe, like with Narcanazo, is that you walk the block. You get to know the local bodega, nail salon, the barbershop, and that includes the local pastor, reverend, monjita, padre, and you talk to them. Because again, some of the official stances at the big church level may not be what the spiritual communities are facing and needing. So there is this disconnect often within spiritual communities. And so that's an effective model. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I'm seeing your comment. Yeah.
Can I share just a beautiful memory? I had the good fortune to give several trainings in Santiago, Chile. And in fact, they translated my book into Spanish, which is available now as a free PDF. So we're actually going to make that available to everyone who signed up, to be part of this for free. But in one of the presentations, what I learned was that before the talk, they had the head priest from the organization, Hogar de Cristo, give kind of an opening talk. And one of the things he said is that Jesus was a harm reductionist.
Mm.
And he really he gave a Christian theological
Mm.
rationale for harm reduction. It was so profoundly moving.
Mm.
But that's just one experience that deeply touched me. And I want to give a shout out to Pedro de Oliveira. He's from Lisbon, and he is a director of a beautiful program for formerly unhoused people there. And we have collaborated on a number of occasions. So I want to say hi, Pedro. And there are other wonderful folks here. Gabrielle Taylor from New Jersey, Anessa from Connecticut, Sadak Iqbal, who has a harm reduction program that's very impressive that I've been following, Jordan Dunn from the city, Sarah Escobar, and others. So thank you so much. Miro Machada from New York, Queens, is in the house. Nancy.
All right. So we got our next question is from Nancy. You want to?
Oh, Nancy Gomez. When focusing on virtual AODA work to reach rural places, how are we able to support clients the best with a harm reduction model? Have thoughts about that? Well, we've all had a lot of experience shifting to virtual work during the pandemic. One of the things I think we all learned is while I don't feel as connected or it's as alive as when we're in person, but I certainly think we can do very effective work virtually with folks. I wonder what your experience is.
Yeah, I think that's another way of like meeting people where they're at, right?
Yeah.
Like and I agree with you. Like in some ways it's so interesting. Our work, the mental health work has been impacted and it hasn't been impacted. I think both things are true. There's definitely a difference when you meet people in person versus virtually. You see people's heads and you miss a lot of the nuance of that connection, and we miss people's bodies, right, when we're in this format. But I also think that very important, profound work, it has been possible, right? And I mean, we were talking about like earlier, like in 2018 we would not have imagined that this could be possible, right? So I think the being able to have different access. I know I've seen a lot of people that would not have been possible, for the past couple of years. So I think in some ways this way of this virtual way has made the world smaller in some ways. So that's, I think, that could be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, for me, that's been one of the upsides of the pandemic. That we've been able to connect with people around the world. We now know virtually. Tamara.
Yeah, I know, Nancy, that your question is very specific around virtual AODA work, but I just want to mention some of the challenges and some of the challenges that I've learned from doing rural work in Puerto Rico. I'm not so much familiar in New York City with Bronx Mobile, but in Puerto Rico, our colleagues from El Punto en la Montaña do a lot of the work along the mountain range of PR. And what they often mention is the challenges of digital equity and high levels of poverty in the mountain regions and other rural areas. I would imagine that is similar in the US. I might be wrong, but in the mainland versus in Boriquen. But that's also a consideration for online virtual therapy, no matter of the space. A digital equity is a big challenge that I find with my participants. There's a lot of options now, for example, for virtual pharmacies, buprenorphine induction, or even telehealth. My folks don't have phones, and if they have phones, they lose them all of the time. And it's not necessarily lost, but it's literally what it means to live on the streets. And so those of us that want to do virtual work, whether that be mental health or medical care provision, we need to think about how are people connecting, HIPAA privacy, confidentiality, and where will the participant or client or patient connect from? What is available in their communities if we are providing the telehealth appointment? So I just want to name it as an ongoing tension, and that's related again to economic inequity and inequality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just shout out Sara Escobar. She says you can see some of the work we're doing in Waterloo region here at drugactionteam.ca. So I look forward to checking that out. And Sadat says, incredible work and presentation. I was curious if you've encountered NIMBY, not in my backyard attitudes, and how you navigated these dynamics. Have you encountered any unexpected allies?
Thank you for the question, Salat, for the questions. Absolutely. Not in my backyard is the direct cousin, primo hermano of gentrification. It goes hand in hand. And how it gets enforced, if you will, is with both police and sanitation sweeps that are constant and disrupt the lives and the homes of the people who live on the streets. That's what I always think about when I hear about an encampment being cleaned up or a police initiative spearheaded by the mayor that they're going to clean up the streets this one weekend and encampments will get dismantled. I think about somebody coming into my home and dismantling it completely and throwing away every single piece of clothing, document ID, and piece of belonging that is part of my life. And that is the challenge of NIMBY, is that in fact it leads to further displacement of people who call the streets home. And again, not by choice. I just want to name it. It's literally because of the trauma of poverty combined with mental health, combined with chaotic and disrupted drug use, combined with migration and all of the isms we've talked about so far. So NIMBY is a reality of those of us that do harm reduction, not just in New York City, but I think across the USA, if not the world. I just, I do acknowledge that there's other people on the call from Portugal and other places. I have a feeling NIMBY is everywhere. The challenge is what is the drug policy, what is the housing policy, right? And that those safety blankets, if you will, security blankets might shift country to country. So how have I navigated it? One is if the participant moves, you move. Bronx Mobile is mobile. We literally move to where the participants are. And so I'm going to encourage people who do mobile work is to don't just pick that one intersection that you will be there Monday through Friday from 8 to 10 p.m. No, do that intersection until it makes no sense to be there anymore and then move to where the participant is, right? So that flexibility in design is in response to NIMBYism and gentrification that forces what we call a constant migration of the person who is unhoused and extremely vulnerable. We've actually we named it some years ago, we called it scaffolding migration in the winter, because what you will also find is that participants migrate from scaffolding to scaffolding, because the scaffolding actually ironically enough, scaffolding is often in kind of like a visual indicator that there's gentrification happening because it's a new building coming up or something's getting renewed and rebuilt. And at the same time, it offers privacy and security for the person that's unhoused. That's the most ironic of it all. But we've named scaffolding migration as a phenomenon within Bronx Mobile. How have we navigated those dynamics? Oftentimes we have participated in community forum and conversations where we invite people into community dialogue. Sometimes during outreach, we actually we're told by people you shouldn't be doing that. That actually just promotes drug use, which is one of the biggest myths around about harm reduction. And to be honest, my priority is the participant and to meet them where they're at with this radical love that is harm reduction. And oftentimes it's also about protecting them from that lens that can be incredibly harmful. So it can be really tenuous, but part of it is treat people with respect and then you will be treated with respect, right? And that can be a little bit contentious at time when you're actually doing direct service provision and something like that happens. Allies, yo, so many allies. Sometimes I get a community member who's like, why are you giving out harm reduction supplies that actually condones drug use? And I'll get another community member who'll step up and then say, actually, they're preventing HIV and hepatitis C. Let them do their work. So oftentimes it is that empowered bystander from the community themselves that you're like, ay, que alivio. I don't have to actually do this fight today. Somebody else is doing it for me. Yay. That happens all of the time. That actually happens more often than not in a really beautiful way. And I think that faith communities, once they understand what harm reduction is, and that actually, in fact, that is the practice of God, right? To love your neighbor as yourself. And they get it, they understand harm reduction. In fact, when you look really quickly, for those of you in New York City, one of the first harm reduction groups out of Albany, New York, was a group of nuns who actually had one of the first syringe exchange programs in that area. That's part of the history of faith and harm reduction and the work out of Albany, New York.
Yeah, let me just underscore what you said. People may not be aware, Faith in Harm Reduction is an organization of faith-based leaders, really. But I also wanted to add and invite the two of you to kind of share about, I think this old model of abstinence only, and we must enforce abstinence at all costs. I understand it as really being based on an old view of what we call addiction. That is addiction as disease, which is only put into remission by complete and total abstinence. And it's kind of an old addiction narrative that then suggests why if you don't accept your disease and you think you can continue to use safely, then you're in denial, right? Another corollary is if people who care about you don't enforce abstinence, they are enablers. And that narrative gave rise to this, it's like drugophobia, or, we must enforce abstinence at all costs. And I think that I find it useful to educate or to share with people that there's a different paradigm, a different model that actually is more true to people's experience, which is that, as I think was implied, I think, Tamara, you were, that people turn to drugs even in problematic ways as a response to suffering, as a response to challenging life circumstances, right, in an attempt to cope or comfort themselves or care for themselves. And that when you shift to that other model, it enables us to actually have more compassion and understanding for why people are caught in a struggle with risky and problematic behavior. And it also really is the reason why a harm reduction approach makes the most sense. Taking away what has been, I think, one of the major barriers to people beginning to make positive change in their lives, the abstinence requirement, right? Both in helping situations and internalized, right? If I'm not ready for abstinence, then I must be an unmotivated, hopeless case, as opposed to, let's start where you are as individuals or as helpers, support steps in a positive direction on your own terms. So the point is, I think that we can do this and may need to do this as part of the education to help communities be more accepting of these approaches. And this old model is so ubiquitous. I mean, as a family therapist, you probably encounter it all the time in families. They're like, well, how come he or she is still using, right?
Right.
You
I,
need to educate. Yeah.
I think, Andrew, I think part of it is the world and the USA in itself is so varied. There could be state by state policies that get enforced at a state level or municipal level that enforce a certain perspective of drug use and how it's perceived, right? So I think of Puerto Rico, which is home, and how in fact under former Governor Pedro Rosselló, a moralistic perspective on drug use was introduced and that it prevails, so that most of the funding goes to 12-step abstinence programs. So again, those, I keep going back to policy, y'all, but policy impacts what money is available for what cares and services, especially for people who depend on Medicaid and public insurance for their health care. So again, if you can afford your own health care and or have private insurance, that state policy may not impact as much, but it might. I mean, think of abortion access right now, right? So I just want to go back to policy because it does impact what is available, and that could vary state by state or territory by territory if you're part of the USA, and that there's, it's the red states versus the blue states, who's in the legislature can impact what is available across different health topics, and I do think that is important to acknowledge.
Yeah.
As a systemic thinker, I think of I like the idea of thinking of concentric circles, that at the outer circle is the policy or the larger systems, and then there are other levels of intervention, right? So it's like the individual, the family, the community, the schools, or the policy, right? And also like the different messages, right? Like the different powers, right? And so I think interventions at any level that includes or that addresses this way of thinking, like meeting people where they're at, can be a very powerful way of destigmatizing rather than judging, right? So you can think of the policy, but you can also think of like the different interactions, the one-on-one interaction that you might have with someone, and what is the impact of bringing maybe shame or not accepting certain things. So yes, it has an impact, right? And so when you offer an attitude, and maybe it's a policy, but maybe it's a message, a direct message to one-on-one, where you're offering this perspective, like I understand that the choices that you're making are coming from a place of pain, and that you're not in the street because this is a choice, that this was chosen for you because of the circumstances, or that you're using substances because this is a way, to use your words, Andrea, this is a way of coping, right? And you might find a different way of coping with the pain that you're dealing with. But there's acceptance, at the core of this interventions.
Mm-hmm. So we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, and I wonder if I can invite each of you to share some final thoughts, anything we haven't addressed that you might like to share with our community.
Well, I can start. First of all, I want to thank Genoveva and Andrew and all of you joining us from your spaces for this dialogue that uplifts and kind of like acknowledges the work that we do in the day-to-day to support people who use drugs and harm reduction psychotherapy and harm reduction direct outreach and work. Final thoughts is for it's going to sound like a cliche, but we really do need to act locally. You need to know your community. You need to know the data in your community. You need to know what is happening. Get to know your unhoused neighbors. Literally get to know them. Winter's around the corner. You know, the hot cocoa, el cafecito. You know, getting them the water. Because that will then let you know also what you need to know and what they need in terms of grounding their work, right? And so I think it's just important that we activate everything we've talked about locally. This isn't just theoretical concept of anti-racist epidemiology and harm reduction psychotherapy that works that lives in the other world or internet. No. This gets activated right here on your community block, in your home, in your church. So think about ways in which you can activate everything that we've talked about so that it becomes part of your day-to-day life.
Thank you.
Thank you. So one thing I'm reading, thank you, Sarah Escobar. So we're going to check this out, the Waterloo region. So thank you so much for that. We'll check that out. So one thing that I just want to highlight is this idea of a continuum, right? And that harm, if we think about harm reduction as all-encompassing and including, not as a discrete and something separate that it's allowing, but it's an approach that brings a different, more comprehensive way of thinking about our communities and the work that we do in different levels.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you so much for contributing to this dialogue, ongoing dialogue and discussion. And I want to thank all of the participants who joined us live, but also all of the folks that are going to see this on a recording. And, I think that you've really shared a lot about what radical love is all about. Truly meeting people where they are with dignity, with respect, with compassion, empowering people on their journeys as experts in their own lives. I feel a lot of gratitude and deeply moved by, both of what you both shared. So thank you all so much. And I look forward to the next meeting that we have.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.